Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Social Outcomes Conference 2024. This is day number 2. And special welcome to this deep dive session. Today, we will discuss how to transform data into evidence and how to transform evidence into better practice. If you are here in person, you are welcome to join the Zoom call, but please make sure to keep your microphone off. And if you are online, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can also share comments and questions in the chat, and we will come, throughout the session, we will come to the Zoom chat to see what is happening online. The subtitle of this session is Putting Data at the Center of Decision-Making. And for those who were not here last year, this session builds on the data session that we did for the Social Outcomes Conference 2023. And I will tell you a bit more about it. This is a session where we share very granular performance data for all of the Life Chances Fund projects. And this was a great session. We were very excited about seeing this data coming through. But once the session was over, we were left with the question, well, how do we make sure that this data is put to good use? How do we ensure that this data gets to the decision-making places, to the board meetings? How do we make sure that this data is transformed into better action and better programs? We will divide the panel. As you can see, this is a big panel. We have lots of speakers. But believe me, when we were reading the contributions that they were sending to the Social Outcomes Conference, everyone here has such a great contribution that I thought everyone deserves a place. That's why we have such a big panel. We will be strict on time because I want to give time for everyone to speak. That's why they don't get that much airtime. But I invite you, all of you, to look at the panel here and find the speakers in the coffee break so you can keep the conversation going. We will divide the panel in 3. This is a bit of an artificial distinction, but I think it will work for us to organize our thinking and to organize this session. We will have a group of speakers speaking about how to transform data into better management. A second group of speakers will discuss how to transform data into better implementation of services. And a third group will discuss how to use data to get better learning, how to use all this data and these evaluation reports that we are writing to make sure that we learn how to do better social outcomes. Without further ado, I want to go to a Slido survey because we also want to see what's the feeling in the room, how do we feel about the use of data and the publication of performance data. And I will ask Maria to put the Slido QR code here. You can just scan it with your cell phone, or you can go to slido.com and use that number to get to the poll. I will give 1 minute for you to go there and vote. When you go and look at the categories that we came up with, please, again, this is something artificial, but we really wanted to force you to pick one category and see what's the feeling of the audience. It's just 1 minute. You can scan it to it. Okay, I see some responses coming up. So I will ask Maria if we can show the results for the first question. Great. So the first question said, how much do you rely on hard, objective data to make management decisions in your work? And I think that the most voted answer was very often, but we also recognize that not every decision can be data-driven. And I think that's what we wanted to discuss today, how much data can play a role, but also the importance of the processes and routines that we put around data to make sure that we transform data into better practice. I will go to Julia. Julia is the head of impact in Acumen, and Julia oversees impact strategy, measurement, and management across initiatives and different funds. And since 2024, she has also been guest faculty for the Oxford Impact Measurement Program at Said Business School here in the University of Oxford. And Julia, I will ask you about your experience with managing social outcomes projects in Acumen. Maybe you want to think of a particular project to refer to and to reflect on the journey to make better and more meaningful use of data coming from these projects. How did you use and interpret data, especially when you go to a decision-making place or especially when you think of a board meeting?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Amazing. I'm so excited, a data session in the morning. I'm really pleased that there's lots of you here. I work at Acumen. We are an impact investor solving problems of poverty. And we have funds and initiatives across different regions. And one of this includes our East Africa Education Facility. And this is a 10-year facility where we invest in startups that focus on improving quality education as well as access to education to low-income students. And this is an example of a fund where, to your point of decision-making, we decided upfront, and data here plays a role, not in terms of decision-making from the numbers that are resulting from data measurement, but it plays a role even from the design of the fund stage. So I think in terms of decision-making and in terms of board decision-making, the first step was actually with the origination of the fund, where we chose to do a performance-based finance component into the fund structure. So what that means is we invest in a social enterprise. That is an investment that typically we invest equity or debt. But then we have a performance-based finance component where they can unlock additional money based on the performance of their impact to optimize that, to offer an incentive over and beyond the investment components that we offer. And what was interesting there is that across our work at Acumen, we have two main principles around data that matter for decision-making. The first is we measure what matters. It's very tempting to get stuck in measuring everything and getting really excited about collecting more data, but actually it's not always useful. And in fact, it doesn't always matter for decision-making or implementing work. And the aim is to magnify the impact. The second component is we measure for action. We measure not for measurement's sake, not to try to get the measurement right. What is needed for action? And that differs. So coming back to your point on decision-making, our board for Acumen as a whole made a commitment to focus on the data for each and every one of our investments. And here we have three components. We focus on the breadth of impact, so scale, how many people are benefiting. Secondly, we focus on those in poverty, so we want to make sure that low-income communities are indeed reached. And third, depth. Now, depth has been the interesting one in terms of that journey, because if you think about depth of impact for education, ideally, our funders initially were saying, oh, we want to see learning outcomes. So we also want to see learning outcomes improve. But actually, what is in our sphere of control as an investor is how you choose the kind of companies that can have an effect. And our companies focus on the quality and access of education. So we have an example of a company that offers loans to schools to improve to build and to improve their classrooms and to buy buses to get more students to the school. Now, if you want to measure learning outcomes and try to attribute that to the loan of our company and therefore our performance on impact, you're going to get lost. You can't attribute that. And this is one of the main things that we focus on. We measure what matters, but we also want to measure what is attributable to the right entity. So we had an interesting set of decision makers, both in terms of our upfront commitment to data, but then also how we invest. And then within our investment process, our investment committees would also look at what is the contribution from the company to outcomes. And then we have the performance-based finance component that facilitates the company to do better with their data. And for the data from the company, we also allow for the voices of the actual parents and teachers to come through, because it's difficult to talk to minors. So we have a proxy mechanism, and we call them. So we use a company called 60 Decibel, and we try to include the voices of the ultimate users of the services to make sure that it's not just the company telling us that things have shifted, but we know that and we can validate and triangulate between data. So across these different components, we see the decision-making at the board come through in terms of how we structure the fund. Then in terms of our decision-making for the deals, we decide per company what is the data look like in terms of poverty focus, depth and breadth of the impact. And then with the company, we focus on what can you improve based on which data points we can collect throughout that process.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned that you work with funders and that you work with social enterprises and other providers. And I think that collecting data and using data that comes from other organizations is a challenge. So can you say a few words about what are the particularities of working with data and a data-led approach in a partnership with other stakeholders? Because I imagine that's another challenge in itself.
Absolutely. But I like to flip it to a positive, because I really feel like we can unlock way more effects from data if we can consider, rather than seeing data as numbers that come out of a complicated process with liaison and with everybody working with data. It's messy, it's incomplete, it's not that easy to translate or to even communicate internally, let alone externally. But if you start to think about, okay, what is actually the function of this data point? I would say there's 4 functions. And if you become aware of which the function is, you can work with it and ideally have some fun with it as well, because lots of people just get stuck in the details or in the difficulty of it. And I say these first the 4 functions that we try to look at is, the first one is, what is the information that is gathered? So this is typically the assumption where you have data, and lots of people think data is learning, is insights, is decisions. It isn't. Data is usually a set of data points. Even if you collate them and put them in a report, it's still a set of collated data points. It only becomes meaningful if you explain what it means and what is the implication for either an assessment or a judgment. So the first thing is still that the ultimate function, what information pieces do you need to know to make sure you have an understanding? The second function is actually a process. So this is, how can you utilize all those moments? Because usually the people who need the ultimate information sit quite far away from where the data needs to be collected. So how can you optimize that process? And again, less is more. If you don't use it, lose it. So we've really tried to simplify that to make sure that the process becomes less painful. It's a little bit like filling in tax forms. Nobody likes it, but how can you at least get on with it and then get to the more exciting bits? The third tool, and this is coming back to the theme of today as well, is like a management tool. How can we utilize this data? And I think this is really where we try to bring in the performance-based finance component to make it incentivized. Usually impact investors require lots of impact data that doesn't mean anything to the company, and in fact becomes a huge burden to their operational day-to-day life in terms of running a business. It's not doing academic research or collecting data. And the last component is like, if you want to incentivize the companies to do this, what's in it for them? And that's where you can actually utilize the data process and the entry point as an opportunity to have a discussion and collaborate and agree. And this is also where a performance-based finance component is helpful. And our journey was really, initially we had all sorts of design over engineering with lots of academic ambitions to try to get the truth and try to force companies to get to learning outcomes. It doesn't work. But if you work together, and that's where we have a successful partnership with bringing the advisory committee and the funders along with where can we use proxies, where can we use secondary data, and how can we bring down the data, not from learning outcomes, but learning the improvement of quality of the education offering, then you can start to work with what also matters for the company. So that's where we had a 3-way collaboration, and the data commitment drove that collaboration, because without the commitment to a performance-based finance structure, we wouldn't have had that commitment. And it also allows you to agree on targets with the company and not making it an extractive, demanding requirement set. You can actually agree with the company and the data collector. So you don't run into problems later down the line when people feel like, oh, I'm hard done by, the data is mixed, because the data is always mixed. Oh, no, I'm not going to get the results that I was promised. No, they've been part of the process. And that's where I get really excited about how, when you connect it also to money, all of a sudden the energy and the motivation changes. So I feel really from our experience that if you look at data as a set of functions and really make the most of each of them, then all of a sudden the conversation becomes more pleasant, more relevant, and actually ultimately, as we all want, an opportunity to optimize impact.
Thank you, Julia. That was super, super helpful. I will move on to Nitya now. Nitya is a development professional with over 9 years of experience across research, monitoring, evaluation and learning, strategy development, and stakeholder engagement. As part of her work with the British Asian Trust, she works on the development and implementation of large-scale OBF initiatives in India, and this includes managing the implementation of the Skill India Impact Bond. And we have some of the providers for the Skill India Impact Bond here, so I'm sure that they will have something to say about it. Nitya, I know that you work for an organization that is a transaction manager with the Skill India Impact Bond, and because of that, you had to put some data systems in place to make sure that there was data sharing and learning across the partnership. And the partnerships is a big partnership because I know that you have many providers, investors, you have many investors too. You don't have only one funder, there are several funders, so it's a big partnership. Can you please say a few words about these data systems and how these data systems help you work in partnership?
Sure. So first, just to say thank you for that question, Juliana, and also thank you for having me here. It's been a wonderful 2 days, I think, of discussion and reflection. Like you said, the Skill Impact Bond is a consortium of 15 partners. So at the bare minimum, these data systems are critical just to make sure that we're not working at cross purposes and that we're able to stay aligned to a common set of goals. The main function that these systems serve for us is building trust and accountability, both within the project as well as with the ecosystem. And this trust is hard won, I think, in the context of the work that we do in the country that we do this work in. Once that is achieved, I think the data systems that we have serve three goals, right? We're tracking outcomes for trainees, the candidates at the center of our project, and our partners here on the panel, OPM, do this very capably, so I won't get too far into that. We're also tracking data systems, data points on the additionality of the DIB instrument for our implementation partners in the room. And I would encourage you guys to catch our partners here, Pan IIT, and ask them many, many questions about this, on what is the additional capacity being built at an implementation level, and what does it take to actually reach those outcomes on the ground. We're also tracking the data at an ecosystem level, right? So for example, in India, nobody has been able to quantify what does it actually take, how much money does it actually take to reach our retention outcomes, 3 months in a job, right? Which is our, I think, apex outcome. And this is a fundamental piece of data that is going to determine whether or not outcomes-based financing is even viable for the skilling ecosystem here in India. The other piece of data that I think we're really excited about is we're going to be working on quantifying the DIB effect together to say it does programming within a DIB and programming outside of a DIB structure. What's really the difference there? And OPM, I think, will talk about that as well. But what this means effectively is that we have a lot of different data management systems and a lot of different partners tracking many different aspects of that data. And I think this is where Julia's point on you have to simplify it, you have to track what matters, and you have to make sure that your data set is coherent and like telling you what you need to know about the implementation on the ground. So that's kind of where our role comes in. As a transaction manager, as an evaluation manager, to be able to pull up a little bit to make sure that these data systems are then feeding into our governance system, into our risk management system, into how do we do decision-making in a crisis, and what are we actually leaving for the ecosystem as our legacy of learnings, and how we actually shift the ecosystem towards tracking outcomes and not inputs. And so that's all been critical. And I think what we've been able to see, the impact of this system, is that it has allowed people to be to almost take a step back, the rationality it brings into decision making, to be able to say, I'm making decision based on data and not emotions, based on rational thought and not gut feel. And also to be able to, I think someone yesterday was talking very interestingly about positions versus interests. And I think in a point of conflict, to be able to say, even if I'm holding different positions, having that data transparently laid out allows you to remember that you have common interests and common goals that you're working towards as a consortium of partners. And I think that is what really has been the transformative point of these systems.
Fantastic. And the theme of this conference is trust and accountability. So I wonder if you can say a few words about what is the role of these data systems in fostering trust and accountability within the partnership.
And I think this is a particularly interesting question for us, given the sector that we work in, because the skilling ecosystem in India, I think a little bit infamously, is not known for a high degree of trust in programming. So each of our partners coming into this project came in with almost a point to prove and a sense of distrust that has been hard won. They've come by it naturally. And so building these data systems, being able to show how each candidate is moving through the system with a point of external verifiability has been able to establish, it's been able to make sure that we are able to see that each of our partners are coming to, it's never black and white. So they're coming in with the correct intention, and we're able to then solve for what is actually the crisis point in the situation. And I think that that has been fundamental for establishing trust in each other as partners, and then in the project within the ecosystem.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I think we have some time, so I can take one question from the audience. And the question ideally should be about data for better management now that we are in this subsection. And I see a hand over there. And there might be, yeah, there's a microphone for you if you can wait for it.
Hi, Janet Phillipson from Prison and Probation Service. So sorry, Julia, I think it was. You said something about measuring what is attributable, and I'm just wondering how realistic that goal is when you're talking about kind of complex cloud partnership scenarios. Is it realistic to say what's attributable to one partner or another?
Yeah, so that's actually been a really interesting learning. So initially we started off with everybody hoping for learning outcomes and then finding a through line all the way to the funder dollars, to our investment dollars, to the company's activities and the ultimate students benefiting. So in fact, we zoomed in. So what we did is we actually wanted to use secondary data and existing literature for the top lines of the pathway, if you like, from the theory of change, and then zoom in for the data collection with the company to those elements that they can influence. So as I mentioned, we've got the three elements in terms of breadth. So this is scale. So how many students is the company reaching? That should be, even within the business model, that is already part of our decision making as an investor. So that is part of what the company should be able and accountable to deliver. The second one is poverty focus. That one is important to us as Acumen because this is what our mandate is. So for the companies, it depends on the proxy data and depends on the schools, but typically also that should be the incentivizing element so that the companies don't just go to the middle income schools where things are generally a little bit better. So this is where the data point can offer an incentive, but it's not always a choice that the company needs to hit 100% because that's also not viable in a business context. The third component was the most important, is that depth of impact. And this is where, for example, what we wanted to see is we have another example of a company that offers lesson plans and a technology for teachers. So they reduce time on admin. Typically, they spend a lot of time marking papers and fiddling around with paper and data entry, et cetera. And this app really reduced that time. And what we then did is we would call both the teachers and the parents to understand, has that time indeed reduced? But then more importantly, has the learning outcomes from the students according to your perception? It's not this is also that you have to work with what you can work with, not with the ultimate truth. So has your perception of the learning outcomes, has that improved? Do you have more time, and has your quality of your teaching improved? And that we triangulate there with the teacher and the parent perspective. So you have to work with multiple data points, but all of those data points were in the aims and in the business models of the company. And in fact, that is attributable to them. And in fact, we find the most powerful data points are the data points that are looking bad. And this is also coming back to the other points around partnership and what you can use for management, is how can you have a respectful conversation about the data? So we had a results call with each of the companies every time we have a study. And rather than judging or like not paying out for certain, well, we wouldn't pay out for results that didn't improve, but then we would say, we would have a baseline, a midline, and an end line. So in midline, if we would see a mixed result, we say, hey, what could be done to improve that data point? So you bring it down to what is in the sphere of influence and control of the company. But then ultimately our through line to our funders in terms of understanding, well, ultimately the teaching time and the teaching quality will lead to better learning outcomes. That is both an assumption, and we can evidence that with secondary evidence. So the attribution you don't have to collect data all the way through. So we really focus on quite a pragmatic approach, aiming for credibility rather than rigorous evidence, and working with secondary data where we can to get that attribution line as clean as we can. But to your point, there's many cloud effects, and also our companies won't be able to influence, say, the nutrition of children if children live in poverty. But that's precisely where this solution helps as well, because then the companies don't feel if the results of the students aren't great, and they know there's been a drought and the farmers in that region didn't have enough food, that region, it's not the company's going to be penalized, because we will judge the company on their ability to improve the classrooms or to include the teaching time, as well as include the quality of content provided by our company's solutions. So we tried to solve for that, but that took us about a year to both get the design right and to negotiate with the ultimate funders. We're like, no, we want to see learning outcomes, and we're like, no, but that's not the sphere of influence of us or the company. So how can you bring it down, but without just getting stuck on outputs and frivolous data? It's like you still need to build that through line. So that's the journey that we went through.
Thank you, Julia. Before we move on to the second group, which is better data for better implementation of services, I will ask Maria if we can see the results for the second question on Slido. And the question was, how transparent are you willing to be with the data from your projects? And the answer that got the majority of votes was, I share as much data as I can, even if the data shows gaps between expectations and achievements, which is a very positive answer. The second group is about implementation of services, and we are mostly referring to the cycles of learning and adaptation that happens in between an implementation process. And I will go first to Benoit. Benoit co-founded TICO in 2014, and he has a background in marketing, having worked for non-profit and for-profit organizations, both in France and Africa. And he manages and oversees operations, leading the development of all the TICO ecosystem. I will go to you, Benoit, because I know that TICO developed a data platform to track outputs and outcomes for a number of projects around sexual and reproductive health, targeting adolescents and young girls in Kenya. And I also know that you're working in close partnership with other organizations, such as the UN Nations and the Kenyan government. Can you please tell me how these different actors use the data from your platform to adapt and improve services on the ground? And what is the data and evidence update that you see for your projects?
Thank you, Juliana. Is it working? Yeah. So first of all, when we talk about governments in the context of our development impact bond in Kenya, we are talking about sub-national government. We're talking about counties. So we implement this program in 10 counties. And the way we work with them, primarily, the very first usage that they've made of our data is around commodity, prevention of stockouts, trying to track exactly what the volume of activity per clinic, public and private, was, and being able to anticipate potential stockouts. One of our stakeholders and the outcome payer in this impact bond is UNFPA, which is the UN Agency for Family Planning. And one of their mandate is about commodity access. So same story, they're also using our data in that manner. And we talk about communities, we talk about specific methods. So we track individual methods and we try to relate these to the nature of the clinic providing the services. The second point where the counties have been using our data, which is very new to them, is to access data related to the private sector. Counties historically had data on the public sector. Data from the private sector was something that felt a little bit intrusive for private practitioners, like think of a small-scale pharmacy. I was wondering why these public authorities want to know more about my business. And in many ways, this has changed a little bit the narrative and helped actually the counties to understand that the private sector is an ally in terms of policies. The third point is related to quality. So we measure quality in multiple manners. One of them is by looking at the preferences of the girls on our platform. We give them access to a large number of public and private facilities. They choose where they want to go. And depending on where they go, we start to get a sense of where basically the trend is. We understand also through a feedback loop, they can rate the services that they receive in real time. So we understand a little bit more their satisfaction there. And the last point is that we do client exit interviews, which are a bit more detailed, a bit longer. And that is extremely valuable data for the public sector and for the counties themselves. The fourth point is that one of our payment metric is actually related to the multidimensional poverty index. And we have a target of having more than 50% of the girls living under multidimensional poverty. This has also been very interesting with the counties because for the first time we go a little bit more granular. The notion of poverty can be extremely complex. And here we can actually look at the dimensions of poverty, the dimensions of vulnerability. And usually in those county meetings, there's multiple actors around the room, other NGOs doing other kind of work, access to water, access to education. And this data has actually led to very interesting cross-functional discussions with all these actors. I would say that maybe to conclude, we've also, through this data, gave visibility to a population which usually is invisible. Adolescent girls in Africa, in our neighborhoods, are basically nothing. Yet, they are the most important population, we believe. So suddenly there's data related to them, their preferences, where they want to go, what they choose. And we believe that this is actually changing the dynamics with the counties.
Thank you, Benoit. That's really interesting. Can I ask one more question? You said that you were working under a development impact bond model, which means that there is a contract and you have very well specified outcome metrics that you need to achieve at the end. But can you say a few words about the role of your data platform in identifying other opportunities for improvements that are not necessarily linked to the outcomes in the contract, but probably they are equally important and they are opportunities for improvement at the end?
So we've got very granular data. So when girls get enrolled onto the platform, it's through demand generation activities done by community-based organizations and mobilizers on the ground. We track the girls all the way to the service uptake and to the repetition, to the continuation on the services that they choose. Just this point, actually, trying to attribute the impact of various demand generation activities is amazing. It's outside of our payment metrics, but it's already giving us a sense of which community-based organizations are doing a good job, which ones could actually benefit from further training, further support. It also allows us to try to understand what is the performance of our own support to those actors, individual, but also in terms of methods. So, we've done a few trainings for that specific community-based organization. What is the impact of that training over time? We've also looked a lot into the method mix, so the choices made by the girls in terms of contraception. We don't have a payment metrics per method. This would be completely unethical. Yet, looking at the preferences and the changes, the trends per county, per clinic, gives us a sense of what's busy happening and potentially of maybe changes in terms of myth in the community. The last point is what we call the power of integration. So our impact, our project under this impact bond mixes outcomes on HIV prevention and prevention of unwanted pregnancies. Girls can access both services, and we can start to understand what is the power of each service to actually bring a girl to adopt a further behavior. Is she coming because she had a doubt about her HIV status? And is it through that work that she starts to hear about contraception and potentially get to the next stage, or vice versa? And this is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I will go to Thomas now. Thomas leads the Social and Health Impact Center at RISE in Sweden. Am I pronouncing it right? Is it right? Okay. This is an initiative launched in 2018 to establish a national center of operational and strategic expertise for driving outcomes-focused solutions in collaboration with the public sector as well as other stakeholders. And I'm going to you, Thomas, because you represent the view of the local government or municipalities. I know you've been working with lots of municipalities to try to make better use of data, and especially to merge and join data from the local governments with the national government. And I want to ask you, what is the uptake of this data and evidence that you see in local governments, and what is the role of the tools that you're working with in helping these organizations make better use of data? And probably you also want to say a few words about the tools that you are working with, because I read your contribution, but the people didn't. So a few words about your tools and how do they help?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so this has been like a long journey, I guess, for me and my team to understand how to actually get data into practice. I mean, I think we recognize that this is a real challenge. And I mean, maybe in the first iteration, we tried to just put out data for everyone to take part of and just use it and hope that this will like get alive by itself. And then we realized that no, it doesn't work like that. And then maybe in the next iteration, we tried to like train and educate and so on, but that neither did that go far enough to get it into practice. And I guess now in our third iteration, we're still developing tools, as you said, about making data accessible, about the quality assurance, about visualization, open source, and so on. But we have added, I guess, a component which is very related to the theme of this conference. It's about how do we actually get buy-in and trust and commitment from those who are practitioners, who might not be as used to work with data or not trained to do that. Also, of course, with managers who, I don't know how many managers are actually want to work data-driven, because I mean, I think many are preferring to rely on their gut instinct or seniority or so on, and the same for practices, and maybe the same for every one of us. That's the human, I guess, inclination to trust our like feelings. So this is very much about behaviors and culture as well, and I think that's what we have tried to add in our toolbox. So now I think this is reflected also in my team. We have those who are very specialists of data and statistics, and maybe the mic doesn't work anymore. Yeah. Thank you. And we have others who are much more experts on how to do change management and how to really interact with those who are not as data-driven, if you say so, or quantitatively focused. So we have logic model frameworks that I think many of you recognize, and we try to merge these different dimensions and work very practically at the local level, be very humble and not try to come with the answers or the evidence or the data, but just put it on the table and then try to really start from the perspectives of those who are actually doing the work, who are meeting the clients, who are trying every day to get the local authority to be a better public health actor, for instance, on a strategic level as well. So I think, and now we're finally seeing some progress, I think, and it's also maybe connected to larger like policy drives that in Sweden, local authorities realize that they have to be much more precise in how to interact with vulnerable groups, for instance. It's not sufficient to just have good universal welfare systems. So I think this is also driven by maybe a larger context. But I think that's also makes it much more necessary to find these tools, because then otherwise we will never find the solutions on these wicked problems. And I guess that's also connecting to the theme of this conference, and also going back to what I said about behaviors. I think that's so important, and it was mentioned in the keynote yesterday as well. because we can have all the processes and structures that we want, but if we don't actually affect the behaviors of ourselves and of those who are providing services or politicians, then we will never get. We try to keep that top of mind and align the tools around that, if that makes sense.
And from one more question from your experience, speaking about the behaviors, what are the behaviors that you have seen in the different local governments and municipalities that can foster transparency and accountability? What have you seen on the ground that works to make services more transparent, even when you have to share data about good projects, but especially when you have to share data about projects that maybe didn't go that well?
Yeah, so I think in our best cases, when we get this level of trust and transparency.
You're very unlucky with the microphone.
Doesn't want me to speak. Thank you. Yeah, so when we reach that state of confidence, then we can notice a discussion which is much more open-minded about what are we doing that actually works and what are we doing that we should maybe stop doing. And I mean, I wouldn't say that we know for sure, because evidence can be somewhat inconclusive sometimes when we're talking about these real world issues. But anyway, that's the start of the conversation, that actually getting practitioners to actively think about what are we doing that doesn't work and what works, and how can we learn more and how can we get the learning outcomes. And when we add that to the logic models and we actually start to monitor those outcomes and the right process indicators as well, for that matter, then I think we are on that journey to actually increase uptake of evidence and also be transparent about what works and what doesn't. But I wouldn't to suggest that we have solved that issue and that we have the perfect system in place by this point. But maybe we can see a journey forward as well, at least.
I'm not sure we've solved it either, but we are on the journey. I will go to Valerie now. Valerie is our only speaker who's online. Can we hear Valerie, or can we see Valerie, please? Valerie is currently the lead of strategy and innovation at Pacific Regional, but before she worked as the director of Central Policy and Planning Office at the Cook Islands Office of the Prime Minister. And her most recent work with the Prime Minister has been to develop the National Population Policy and also the National Sustainable Development Agenda, which gives a 100-year vision towards the well-being of the people of the Cook Islands. Thank you very much, Valerie, for being here with us today. I know it's really, really late for you, but we really appreciate it. And I thought that Valerie was a great addition to this panel, because she represents the national government perspective. Here we have, most of us are working in projects that last for 5, for 10, for 15 years, but that's our time span. Valerie was developing a national policy for the next 100 years of the Cook Islands. So I want to ask Valerie, how do you work when you have to develop a policy for such long term? And what are the data points and the indicators that you chose to make sure that you were tracking progress and outcomes during this journey of 100 years?
Thank you very much, Juliana. Kia ora na tātou katoa, and warm greetings from the Pacific. I'm currently in Suva, Fiji, but home for me is the island of Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. I guess much like my seafaring ancestors, my people have been on a journey, a sort of renaissance in terms of reclaiming our knowledge and putting it at the center of what we do. And so I have had the privilege and honor to create the methodology which developed our country's 100-year vision towards Turanga me metaki, or broadly interpreted as well-being or holistic well-being for all. The starting point is ensuring that you have a concept that binds all your people, ensuring that people are at the center, and also that the values that you share are good for all. So under the framework, we use the binding concept of papa'anga, which is genealogies, to connect all of our people across the country. If you haven't heard about the Cook Islands, it's 15 islands spread over 2.4 million square kilometers. And so the distances are so vast. but we needed a concept or anchor that brought us all together. So Papa'anga was it. Under the framework that we developed, we have the 100-year with our shared understandings, our thematic areas which we prioritized, and a broad definition of well-being, understanding that it will change over time, noting that well-being is objective and also subjective. And so when we come down to measurements, it becomes a bit tricky. Because the idea of genealogies spans generations, we decided to have the 4-generation, 100-year plan, then come down to a 1-generation outcome document, which highlighted 6 targets that the country wants to achieve over the next generation. Under that document, we also highlighted from the evidence and research that we collected about 32 projects which different agencies across government and even non-government organizations could pick up over the next 25 years. One of the big challenges in the Pacific is sustainable financing. And with the onslaught of climate change and the effects that it's sort of wreaking on our nations, the accessibility to funding, such as the Green Climate Fund, has forced us to plan a bit longer term because it takes about 10 years to try and access any money. And then coming down to the 5-year scorecard, where we developed 72 indicators across the 15 goals or thematic areas. Those are very interesting. And we have a 1-year indicator report, which you can access on the Office of the Prime Minister website of the Cook Islands. But again, just going back to our #1 goal of well-being and trying to properly measure well-being has been a huge challenge. So we've had the 5-year plan for 3 years now, and we've published 2 indicator reports. And the challenge is still the well-being indicators, which a lot of it doesn't really align to the SDGs, only because it goes beyond the 2030 agenda. But it's definitely an evolving space for our country, and we're learning as we go. Definitely understanding, I guess, in terms of reviewing the methodology, understanding the metadata, and how we can do it better. Because at the end of the day, what we should be looking at is the outcomes and the impact that it has on our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Please stay online because we will do a round of questions and answers later, and I'm sure that you will get some questions from the audience. Before we move to the next session, I still think we have some time, so I will take a question from the audience, and ideally the question should be about better data for better implementation of services. Do we have a question? Okay, I think we can move on. I will ask Maria to show the results of the 3rd question on the Slido poll. Not yet. Now we can see it. So the 3rd question was, from your own experience, which type of evaluations have left you with more learnings and insights? And of course, these categories are, the distinction is arbitrary, but we really wanted to force you and to see what was the type of evaluations that you prefer. And the answer that got the most votes was experimental and quasi-experimental evaluations with quantitative methods. And this is a really interesting answer that we will delve into with the rest of the panel. The third group that we have here is a group of people working on evaluations and people coming from the academia, and we will explore how to use data for better learning, how to make sure that we use data to learn, how to do better services, and to make sure that data doesn't die in a spreadsheet. I will go to Falasha and Divya. Both of them work for the Oxford Policy Management Group, and both of them are evaluating the Skill India Impact Bond. So I think the thing that really struck me from your contribution to the Social Outcomes Conference is that you really don't define yourself as an evaluator, or not just as an evaluator, but you also say that you're a learning partner. And I was wondering if you could share a few words with us about what is the difference between being an evaluator and a learning partner? What are you referring with that name?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think in the Skill Impact Bond specifically, we play two roles. So on the one hand, we evaluate the payment-based outcomes, but we also play the role of the learning partner, and increasingly that is a very important role for the entire consortium, but equally it's also the most exciting role for us. So we are very fortunate in that the entire consortium of partners is very keen to learn. So there is the focus on payment-based indicators. So Skill Impact Bond aims to train 50,000 people over a 4-year period. And during that period, we're looking at 3 outcomes: certification, placement, and retention. So our role as a learning partner is to bridge the gap between evidence and program implementation. We help translate that evidence into concrete insights that can help adapt program implementation and strengthen it throughout the program cycle. Maybe we can come in after that on your next.
Oh,
Would you
okay.
like to add something more?
Would you like to add something else? No, okay. I wonder, and I will go to Falasha then, but I wonder if you could say a few words about the role of a bridge, because that's a metaphor that we also use a lot at the GoLab. We also say that we are bridging evidence with practice, but it sounds fantastic, but it's really, really difficult to do it on the ground. So I wonder if you can tell us about the tools, the data points, and the routines and the processes that you do and you work with to make sure that the bridge actually works and you're actually bringing data from one side of the bridge to the other side of the bridge.
Is this working?
Is it working?
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a really interesting question on how do we really use the data and evidence to drive action on the ground and drive learning. And how we do that at OPM is we do it at 3 levels: at the trainee participant level, at the program level, and then at the ecosystem level. And just to give you a flavor of how does this really work on the ground, at the trainee participant level, one of the key driving questions of our learning agenda is, why do young people drop out of the workforce, particularly women in India, right? And cohort 1, the evaluation that we did for cohort 1, provides some rich learnings to answer that question. For example, we learned that many young women, particularly from indigenous communities in certain eastern states in India, who had enrolled in the Skill Impact Bond and joined the garment factories down south, were increasingly dropping out. And a key learning pointed to the fact that one of the key reasons why this was happening was their poor health and nutrition outcomes. We learned that many of these women were undernourished to the extent that they were unable to perform routine tasks on the factory floor. There were instances of fainting that were reported. And when we did share these findings with the stakeholders, a joint decision was taken to integrate health and well-being as part of the program design thereafter. So that's one example at the trainee participant level. But I can talk a bit about the programmatic level, the second level.
Yeah.
And typically in programs, exactly as many of the panelists also talked about, there's often a gap between project implementation and evidence generation. And within the Skill Impact Bond, all the stakeholders have been quite deliberate in making sure that we try to make attempts to bridge this gap. And one of the ways in which we try to do this is by holding these periodic closed-door safe space learning workshops, where we share evidence, yes, But what's more important is that we collaboratively brainstorm with our stakeholders on how to solve some of these problems on the ground. And just to quote one example of how we did this on the ground is from a recent learning workshop that we conducted, where we shared insights from a very innovative research participatory tool focused on youth aspirations. And what happened at the end of the workshop was quite interesting. We had some of the implementers come back to us and ask us to share the template of the tool with them. They felt that applying it as part of the implementation efforts would help them improve services on the ground by aligning what we offer to the real aspirations and needs of the young people. So that's another example of how we try to drive change in very real terms at the program level.
And maybe just to add to that, we are more than halfway through the program implementation. And this is where we are seeing new questions emerge. So in the first wave, the questions were really about what's happening on the ground. Are these outcomes being met? But now the trust and the confidence that we built with all the partners has also meant that new kinds of questions are coming up. And the questions are, how do we scale up this program? And if we were to scale it up, what elements do we keep and what do we remove? So what would the next version and next iteration of the program look like? Is there evidence to show that a DIB model truly improves outcomes? Can you prove that using evidence? We challenge you. So that really keeps us on our toes, and we have to use new kinds of methods. And lastly, this is very important because this is not just evidence generated for skill impact bond. It's actually evidence generated for the entire skills ecosystem, because there's very limited in-depth impact evaluations of skills programs, which have been running in India for over a decade now. And we've integrated mixed methods. So it's not just quantitative survey results that really drive impact, but we also have longitudinal studies where we track women for 1.5 years over 5 touch points to look at their transition over time. And now to pull out those insights, communicate it in a very succinct, clear way to policymakers and identify those levers of change is what we're really looking forward to doing in this last phase of the evaluation.
I have a quick question. I see that there's lots of learning and adaptation happening on one side of the evaluation, the side that is more related with the learning partnership. Those learnings and adaptation processes, do they affect the more quantitative evaluation, the one that is more experimental and where you make some assumptions about your control and treatment group?
Actually, they don't really, because they happen in parallel. So the quantitative evaluation is very clear-cut because the indicators are very clearly defined. So the learning and adaptation explains why we're seeing the results as they are. So for example, why are women dropping out after a specific period of time? Does it make a difference on where they're placed? What can be done with employers to help retain women? So it doesn't really impact the measurement of the survey. Would you like to add anything?
Thank you. I will go to our last speaker, which is Sabine Alcayer. Sabine directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the Oxford Department for International Development. And together with Professor James Foster, she developed the Alcayer-Foster method for measuring multidimensional poverty, a flexible technique that can incorporate different dimensions or aspects of poverty to create measures that are tailor-made for each context. And Sabina comes from the academic world, and she's here because we want to reflect together on what can we do here from the academic side, the research side, the people who live on universities and research centers. What can we do here better to provide better data and evidence to the practitioners, to the practitioner community? And Sabina, I will go to you because you have great experience with the use of the multidimensional poverty index. I've seen lots of projects using this index as a measure of poverty, and even Benoit uses the index for his own project. So I want to see what's your experience in sharing data about poverty with different projects. How do you make sure that that data is put into practice?
Thank you so much. And I'm here really to learn from you. But we can't ensure that data are used. But Sir Tony Atkinson, who is a great leader of work on poverty and inequality for 50 years, observed that there's something different when you measure poverty as an academic, and that is that you must try to link it to action. There's a responsibility. And he also observed that in the times of the Sustainable Development Goals, our metrics, our measures, are also performance indicators. And so there's been sort of a shift in how we design data to have much more of an emphasis on the users. So what do we do as a research center? We work in two broad areas. We work with government partners to do official permanent statistics on poverty that are there year in and year out across changes of government and political party. And at the moment, 84 countries report these as the SDG indicator on multidimensional poverty, 43 of them in developing countries, 41 of which we've worked with, and that's about 3 billion people. And they're disaggregated extensively by 7,222 subnational groups. So there's a body of data updated regularly on different aspects of poverty, where the shape of poverty is different if you are in Armenia or the United States than if you are in Sierra Leone or Maldives or India. The second thing we do is we work on a global multidimensional poverty index, which has the same 3 dimensions and the same 10 indicators for 110 countries this year. It'll be 112 when we update next month. We cover 6.1 billion people at the moment, and 1.1 billion of them live in acute multidimensional poverty. What is multidimensional poverty, whether it's national or whether it's global? It's a measure that asks how many things are going wrong in the life of a person, where those things that are going wrong, those deprivations, are policy relevant. As Julie said, they are things that we can change with action. And they are things that resonate with the lived experience of the experts, who are the poor men, women, and children. If you are deprived in a critical mass of these, a quarter, a third, 40%, you are identified as poor. And that's what it means to be multidimensionally poor. And so 1.1 billion people of those that we measure are in that state. Half of them are children. 83% live in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. We can go down to 1,281 subnational regions to look at children, to look at elderly, to look at people living with disability and ethnicity status. So that's, in a sense, the data that we have. Why might this be of use to you? So what is a multidimensional poverty index? Having identified who is poor, you take all of the deprivations that they experience and you add them up. And the height of that stack of deprivations is a multidimensional poverty index. It has fancy properties, but basically it's a stack of deprivations. So if any business, public sector, NGO, family from the bottom up gets rid of one deprivation, the height of the stack goes down. Multidimensional poverty goes down. And so it's quite a sensitive tool for policy, and it changes more responsively to government actions. If you put a child in school, it's years before that child will get a job and change the income poverty levels of that country. But if school attendance is an indicator, then that year, the out-of-school children will mean that multidimensional poverty will go down. So it can reflect, obviously, in Europe, the indicators will be very different than in lower income countries. So where do we go from here? First of all, can poverty change? We are in a wonderful situation to try to think of measures not as being something that people hate, that make them feel guilty and ashamed, that they dread the updates, but to try to make poverty a celebration of success, to use metrics to spot where change happened, to find out how it happened, and to celebrate it. Because in a sense, then people are motivated to use poverty metrics, and they feel that with attribution comes a recognition. It can be aligned with professional goals. As a person, it is a performance indicator where there can be a positive outcome. So one example is the country of India, where with the global MPI that we measure, 415 million people left poverty in a 15-year period from 2005-06 to 2019-21. The poorest were children. They had the fastest reduction. The poorest were scheduled tribes. They had the fastest reduction. The poorest religious group were Muslim. They had the fastest reduction. The poorest states like Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh had the fastest reduction. So this was not only a dramatic reduction of poverty, but it was a pro-poor reduction. Each of the 10 indicators in India's MPI went down. And so we do this kind of trend now for, this year it'll be 6 billion people, and we can spot changes. And 25 countries were able to cut multidimensional poverty by half in 4 to 12 years, which means that the Sustainable Development Goal is possible. An example of how is this then actioned? How does this come in from data, from observing success to actually generating success? Juan Manuel Santos was president of Colombia from 2010 to 2018. In 2011, he released a multidimensional poverty index. Blair government was using Bobber Deliverology Unit. McKinsey helped with the Blair government to link the MPI of Colombia to be KPIs for the different ministries. He chaired a round table with ministers who could not send deputies. Every year they updated, they asked whose indicator was moving. They had flexible pot of money. If it wasn't, they decided as a community, what will we do this year to unblock the bottleneck? Because reducing poverty is a team sport. We have to play together. We have to play to win. And using data, we can see the team sport aspect. Coming back to India, 15% of the poor people now, 34 million people, have only 4 deprivations. Nobody in their household has 6 years of schooling. They don't have adequate sanitation. Their house is kacha, it has impermanent roof, wall, or floors, and they cook with wood, dung, or charcoal. No natural government programs address these 4 indicators together, but with data we can make that visible, actionable, so progress can accelerate. So across a 64-country South-South network, we just met 2 weeks ago in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Governments are using their measures in many different ways. I won't have time to go into that. They're sharing lessons, they're writing books. The Vice President of Costa Rica is now coordinating the executive education. So it's just to say, as a concluding slide, if you wouldn't mind, that there are ways that we hope that data on poverty could be used for outcome approaches. And first of all, to measure outcomes that can be attributed where the needle can be moved, where they reflect the programs and initiatives, to recognize and celebrate where MPI fell the most, and then to be able to attribute it. And so hopefully there could be a connection between these metrics that do exist at scale, are updated regularly, are rigorous and published, and this kind of initiatives, but right now they are not. And so that's why it's so exciting and humbling to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. That was fantastic. If we can stay on that slide, I really want to ask a question about point number 3, because while you were speaking, I was thinking, well, maybe that's what we need to do more. Instead of framing data and indicators as something, as a measure of performance, and look at this as not as a carrot but stick, and think, no, if I underperform, there will be a punishment. If I underperform, I don't get payments. If I underperform, like, instead of having people dreading the publication of data, if we frame it in a different way and we recognize, attribute, and celebrate the good news, if we see which are the funds that have moved the needle the most, it really provides a different framing, and that might be a way of making sure that people use more data and data doesn't die in a spreadsheet. So can you say a few words about how you've seen that working in practice?
Right. It depends on the quality of external data. But I'll give just a very banal example. We could think of undernutrition. And we could think of child undernutrition, which is something many, many countries have data for and is important. If that is an outcome of some different initiatives, and they could say this many children were undernourished and they obtained a sustained support system that means that they are not undernourished and are not likely to be in the next year because of the supports, then you can say, well, how many of those children were poor? Because they may not all be. And with those 2 questions, you can then, in an accounting system, say, okay, you think that you got this many children out of poverty, so in terms of the MPI, the stack went down this much. Next time the data on poverty are updated for that particular local area or population group, you can see how much it moved, and you can say, well, this program, if the data are right, we're responsible for reducing multidimensional poverty by 10%. And you can just be public about it. If people disagree with the data, then they know exactly the transparent logic that you have. We're talking with the Supreme Audit institutions that have just done work on climate, and they're quite energized to work on hunger and poverty because of the Brazil leadership of that group at the moment. And they're thinking, well, what can we as auditors do? But I think it's not rocket science. You don't need RCT data, but with the existing data and just a very clear, it depends on the data quality, but you can make clear your assumptions, and under those assumptions, the attribution.
Thank you. And I think we have some time for questions and answers now. And I would like to get a question for the group about better data for better learning. And then I will open the floor for questions about anything that you would like to ask to the speakers. Do we have a question about better data for better learning? Yes, Caroline.
Can I ask you to repeat?
Sure. Sorry, I'll repeat. I appreciated your discussion of the use of both process and outcome measures together, along with the logic model. It's something that makes a lot of sense, right? We care about the outcomes, but we really want to know what's driving that and be able to learn from that and modify processes if necessary. I was just curious to know, it's something I teach at the university, and I sometimes think that practitioners find the whole process of developing a logic model and things like that sometimes abstract, but I'm curious to know how you've done that to make it of something that people see as valuable and to the extent to which people really engage in that process.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. And I think we have worked quite a bit with how to actually engage with practitioners on the logic modeling, for instance. And I think it's a combination of making it simple enough and also how you lead, how you co-create the logic modeling. And it's very much about people skills, I would say, on the workshop leaders and the change managers in my team or everywhere where you're doing these things, and actually engaging with the practitioners and not, as I said, coming with all the answers beforehand, which I guess that can happen in some circumstances that you're hurried and there are circumstances that just drive that sense of someone else is telling us what to do, and then we put it in these nice boxes in the logic framework. So yeah, that's our approach, at least. Yeah.
Yes, maybe you can use my microphone.
Okay. Yeah, just to add on that, I think the other thing, what tends to work well for us is not calling it a theory of change or a logical model at all. Just own that as the facilitator and let people talk. What does success look like? What are you doing? And then you box it out. And you're like, does that sort of make sense? So there's a lot about even the language, the theory of change. It sounds quite dry, and people find it really reluctant because it's all very boxy. It's very limited and restrictive. So everybody gets uncomfortable and they feel misrepresented. But actually, if you can say, look, usually I start, well, who loves the theory of change? Who hates it? It's like, well, it's a bit of both, but then let's work through it, because as much it is linear and limited, it's the best articulation that you can get in terms of what is your understanding of the pathways of change that you hope to enact. So if you can facilitate it even without, but it requires a bit of skill and requires multiple workshops. There's no such thing, and we've had fund managers that think that they can get a consultant to do it for them, and then it just sort of it doesn't have the power that it can have, but it requires planning and some resourcing with getting people in a room, ideally with a whiteboard and multiple sessions to refine it before you even start to think about indicators. Because that's the other downside. As soon as people think, oh, a logical model, we just need to get indicators, they jump straight to either what's measurable or what's not measurable, neither of which is really representing what their vision or what really is meaningful for people. So we find like not using the jargon language works, using workshops and actually thinking quite pragmatically about the data points, but in session 2, not straight away. So that's some of the things that we found tends to work for us.
And I have another question over there. Would you like to introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Eleanor, and I'm a student at Oxford. So thank you for letting me listen in, and thank you all for your talks. They're really interesting. My question is for Sabina. I really liked all the insights you brought and the data you brought to the presentation as well. It was really interesting to look at some of those. My question is on some of the challenges you face in looking at so many different regions across the whole globe, there's a lot of diversity there. How do you kind of ensure you're keeping data standardized, and any other challenges you face in doing that? I'd be interested.
Thank you. So for national multidimensional poverty measures, these are nationally owned and operated with their own statistical offices as government statistics. And so what we do is we have technical training courses, and often we come in to validate with robustness tests, with making sure that in a plural society where we disagree with each other, that the measures are not very fragile in terms of policy conclusions to debatable weights, debatable cutoffs. And so that's sort of a technical bag of tricks that we do. But for a global multidimensional poverty measure, we use data in the public domain. All of our computational files are online. Anybody can download them and redo the data and criticize us. All of the decisions we've made on every data set are itemized in the methodological notes. And we work with the data providers. We don't gather data for 6.1 billion people. We can't. So we use primarily two sources, the Demographic and Health Survey and the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, the latter by UNICEF, the former funded by USAID. And we know the data providers. And so there was a country last night I was writing and saying, you know, these data look a bit suspicious, so explain. And we know them. And so they'll say, yeah, there were some problems, and we'll just quietly put it to one side. We're not watchdogs, but we make sure that what we put out, we can stand behind.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yes, please, Arushi. Okay, then we can go to the online quiz.
Okay, thanks. My question is for the Skills Impact Bond colleagues, and very much interested in your analysis of DIB versus not DIB, right? Giving financing through that, we've had conversations before, but more on the learning aspect of that. Depending on what results you get or the funders you have, whether it's investor side or the outcomes funder side, do you think they would be interested in changing their approach if you start finding that the effects could happen with other types of financing? Or there is a strong drive to make sure that the impact bond model itself is working? So how would they use the learnings you get?
I think your luck is catching. Sorry. So I think that's a great question, right? And I think as we've been working on defining what this study could actually look like, when we're picking an appropriate counterfactual to even compare against when we're looking at DIB versus non-DIB, the mandate that we've gotten from our partners is, don't just tell me what is good and what is not, tell me why, right? Help me understand what it is that is driving these outcomes. Help me understand what it costs for me to do that. Help me understand how I can bring that in at scale. I mean, we are reaching 50,000 people in the context. It's the largest program of its kind globally, but in the context of India, we're a pilot project, right? And so when we're thinking about what these programs actually look like at scale, the practical realities around what is going to even be possible to scale is a big factor in whether or not they're going to be willing to adopt some of these measures. So that's going to be really critical for us. And I think that's why it's also not just the quantitative evaluation that OPM will lead, but also the work that we're doing with our implementing partners to say, what are you doing differently? Help us understand what has been brought into your implementation on the ground. What do you do under the national state programs? What do you do for CSR? What do you do for us differently? And then also the training experience, right? The work that OPM does on understanding what drives them, why are they signing up, what is it that drives some of that retention? So all of that has to kind of come together. And so it's different sources of data to those key decision makers that's going to really define the answers. So the short answer is we don't actually know the answer to your question yet.
Just quickly add to that, just to say that if there's one thing I'd really like to highlight from our experience is that learning really matters. It's not just a word, but actually that extra effort that goes into looking deep within the data and triangulating it with the qualitative material is really important. And because those are the questions that are completely unanswered, and to answer them and have a consortium of partners who care and who have the power to change things, I think that's a magic combination. And that's really the power of data.
I think we have an online question, but then I will go to you, Elsa.
Thank you. Our online question is, please share some experience or thoughts about the data collection on unintended results of the programs.
Who wants to take that one?
I mean, the only thing that I can say is from somebody many of the measures are done with participatory work at the grassroots level, with poor people in communities, and periodically it's updated. And what is interesting is that sometimes the effects that they value are not measured. So knowledge or friendship, getting together in a group, or the meaningfulness of work. And so there's some positive things. And then there are also times when interaction, you realize that there are things that simply you cannot measure, that either we're going well or we're going badly. And so it's a little bit humbling, because you realize that, you know, it's really important to them, to their experience of this initiative, but you're not going to be able to measure it in your normal statistics, either because it's too idiosyncratic or too qualitative. And so I think it's very useful to go back and forth and to keep asking the questions. But I think what we've all been saying is that as you go back and forth from the remote areas or the grassroots back to the measurement side, you can tune the measures and you keep learning and keep adjusting. And this happens in national multidimensional poverty measures. Now, many countries, having run them for 10 years, are modifying them. And they've learned a lot about what they want to put in next time.
Yeah, I can add to that. Oh, sorry. In our case, we listen to the ultimate users, and what they tell us is fascinating, both on the positive sides, but also on things that they're not happy with. And these are the most useful commentary that the companies can use, and also that are insightful for us. So these can be specific things such as solar-empowered solar pumps for irrigation in agriculture. If the battery life doesn't work well, or for other models where the farmers are needing to be paid, if the payment is not going well, the operational side, then the customers are very unhappy. So we actually take that into account, and this is something that you won't get from the company because they also don't know. But also, you don't get this because you started with that exciting workshop on your theory of change. So you've got all these development outcomes, and then by the time you've had to narrow it down because data collection is messy and costly, you try to be quite specific on the things that you ask about, hoping that you could link it back. But often it's not as clear cut. And one of the main things we find, for example, with impact investors, we tend to be very keen to see income increases for the ultimate users of our company's products and services. But actually what tends to matter alongside an increase in income, which is a nightmare to measure, by the way, is also the consistency, the reliability, the speed at which payments are being delivered. So that's where you get unintended results, but they're actually really insightful, both as like two things. One, to make you more humble about what it is that you can actually drive and how, you know, how these dynamics matter on the ground without you being sort of aware of it. But secondly, it's actionable. So then even for the companies, like, oh, we really need to sort out our payment structure, but also for us as an investor to be, when we're on their board, to make sure they get their operations right. So it creates this feedback loop, and it's also offering a good opportunity to speak back to the funders. Of course, you're always going to be limited to, you can only know what you can know, but it's about, I think it's more about an openness to learn, and that iteration and feedback, and engaging with the ultimate users, that I think has been quite powerful in our experience.
Yeah, and the power of qualitative data. I think that's what you're saying in many ways. I was a bit surprised in the results to see it at the bottom, but to be honest, to check on unintended consequences of your program, especially in our case, we've got a big incentive part of the program. It's qualitative data that has helped us not to make some mistakes, realizing again changes in attitude. When we're talking about changes in perceptions, and I think that's something we shouldn't forget, even when we are very driven by data.
Yes. The last thing I would add to that is it's the same question, right? The consortium, I think the Skill Impact Bond Consortium has made it a point to say, we're not just asking what is happening, we're asking why it's happening. And when you keep asking why, That's what really gets you, what's the next level, what's the next level, what's the next level? And that's, I think, how we've always found we've gotten to that question. Just keep asking why.
Thank you.
Can I add?
Yeah.
No, just to add to Nitya's point. So since we triangulate our data from multiple sources, I can just share a bit about some of the positive spillovers from the program, the access to skills training and employment that have come up from our data so far, such as, young women sharing that skills training has given them the confidence that they'd never had, not just in the workforce, not just at the factory floor, but beyond, or give them better decision-making power within the household to study further or to take their own decisions when they earlier could not before joining the program. So we continue to document some of these very positive results that we're also seeing on the ground.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And I know you have a question, Elsa.
I suppose I was just want to start with a slightly provocative question, which isn't actually my question, but is there a risk of us creating a kind of industrial data complex that we've got all these data professionals running around doing lots of data for people? And actually, if we were to dial forward 10 years, and there's loads of capability and skills built up within the organizations who are delivering change, what is the role for data and evidence and evaluation professionals working alongside that? What is the right role for them?
That's a great question. Do you want to take it, Sabina?
I think it's changing so fast. And certainly in our world, the prevalence of citizen data, of bottom-up community data, where people are gathering it, analyzing it, and using it at the local level, and then corroborating it with other data sources is mushrooming. And I think there's an imbalance now in that a lot of the historical data collection has been we collect the data, we analyze the data, and the family who's just given the data doesn't know they don't know if they are poor or not. They don't know how they are poor. And so there's an asymmetry and an imbalance that I think has to be redressed and is being redressed. And so the question that you asked is, okay, given that, fast forward 10 years, there will be more, like in the Philippines, the community-based monitoring system. There's some countries that have this already going. So when that is spread out, then the communities will have their own analyses, their own understandings, their own discourse. But sometimes there will be, again, severe power imbalances at the community level. And I think corroborating, triangulating with other data sources, and so you can pick up where there might be other stories, where there might be things to investigate, where there might be questions to ask, that will be one very useful thing, because there will be lots of different incentives that different actors would have to make outcomes better or to. So one feature of statistical offices has been their independence and their autonomy, which is never not under threat, but it is a feature of that is at the moment very hard to secure for the other kind of citizen-based data. So I think that's a conversation that we're very actively engaged in and looking forward to seeing the next generation of it.
Yeah, and in our context, I think we're trying to shift the focus of all these resources who are currently working with data, for instance, in the local government, but they are not meeting the services or they don't interact good enough. So we have an idea of building a community of practice where we try to engage the statisticians employed by the local authorities, because Swedish local authorities, they employ a lot of people and might be more powerful than comparatively in other countries. But anyway, they don't meet the services. So we have to find ways to make these interactions much more productive and business as usual, if you say so. So that's one ambition we have with working with data and trying to get it into practice. And also on the national side, they could do a much better job on national service, for instance. How are they meaningful? How can the data from them be used for local improvement and so on? So there's also the connection between national and the local.
If I could add, just at a very practical level, right? Because I think it's an interesting question to grapple with in terms of how do you make data usable and practical, but not burdensome at the same time? Because the sheer weight of what it takes to be able to drive the verifiability and the third-party verifiability of this data. I think for our trainees and for our training providers, the effort and investment it takes to build these systems makes it an interesting question, right? And if we're thinking about scale, we have to be thinking about what do you scale, what components of that do you scale, and how do you make it useful without strangling the life out of a program, right? And that's, I think, been our very interesting question that we've been grappling with as we think about scale and what's next is how do you also then streamline some of these systems while you're trying to build the credibility of them.
Just very last
Yeah.
point is
Very
we
good.
also change our perceptions about evaluators. I remember the first time in Skill Impact Bond, we were just really excited about the evaluation, and we found everyone looking at us very seriously, maybe taking us a bit too seriously because our payments were linked to the outcomes. And I think, but more and more we find wonderful, meaningful conversations between evaluators, implementing partners, and public policy specialists, where we all learn from each other. So we are not just monitoring people, but we are learning partners. And that's why maybe calling ourselves learning partners is a much better term for this ecosystem.
That's fantastic and a great way to end the panel, calling ourselves learning partners. I think we're at time. Thank you very much for being here today. There is a QR code if you want to complete a feedback form. I know this was a very big panel. We are lots of people in front of you. We didn't have that much time for each of the speakers, but this is really not finishing here. I invite you to go to the coffee break and find these people in the coffee break. We are all very, very happy to keep the conversation going here. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the conference.